It's 2003, and Islamic insurgents are flooding into Iraq to fight the U.S. invasion. A young female undercover journalist is taking a huge risk being seen in this public place. There are only a few Westerners and women amongst this angry crowd. Suddenly, over the loudspeaker, someone screams, "Americans, Americans!" The journalist looks up in horror to see a young man rushing at her with a knife.
I knew I couldn't go back.
You just put it out there.
She said you've got less than a year to live.
Just dug even
Luck
deeper.
is the residue of design.
Nobody else was doing it, so why couldn't I?
That was the turning point.
Welcome to the BUCKiT podcast with Phil Keoghan. Every week I talk to mavericks, disruptors, and innovators. People who ditch the excuses, swerve off the predictable road, and epitomize what it means to tick it before you kick it. Mariana van Zeller is an award-winning journalist who's been on assignment for the past 15 years, covering stories about the war in Iraq, the sex slave trade, opioid abuse, drug cartels, and illegal immigration. Many times undercover and in the most dangerous situations a journalist can find themselves in. She's been chased by knife-wielding insurgents, harassed by gang members, and attacked by flesh-eating bacteria, and she survived it all to tell her stories. I caught up with Mariana between assignments and just after she'd dropped her son off for his first day at school. How are we doing, Scott? Good? Mariana van Zeller, and we are in Santa Monica, California. So, I understand you just dropped your son off at school?
I did.
Yeah. Second day at school?
Second day.
So you had to battle LA traffic to get here?
I did.
Yeah.
It's not easy when you live on the east side to come all the way to the west side. It's like going to another country.
So what's tougher, battling LA traffic or being in a war zone?
Well, you can ask me which one I prefer.
Yeah, what would you prefer?
To be in a war zone.
Okay, that shows you how bad it is, right? How bad the LA traffic is.
It is. It's awful. It is really awful. And at least, there's a purpose to being in a war. You feel like you're doing something. You're bearing witness to something.
Yeah.
You're in traffic. You're just,
Yeah.
getting more and more anxious by the second.
And that's
But I got
something
here.
I really want to get to. I mean, because you have a passion for these danger zones, I guess you could say, that is, I think you have to have a special gene to want to go tell those stories. For me, it instills fear as a storyteller to be trapped in the middle of these stories, but this is something that you crave, so we'll get into that. But I'm just reading up on some of your history as a journalist, because past 15 years you've been a journalist?
Yeah.
Around there. I mean, you've been all around the world. I was reading about how you camped out in the Amazon.
Oh, yeah.
You rode on this death train. You snuck into the swamps of Nigeria to meet up with militants who were armed with AK-47s. Can you share a couple of stories with us about, I guess, being embedded with a group of people and what that's like how you actually close your eyes at night and
Right.
drift off to sleep without worrying that something's going to happen to you?
I'm not a worrier usually.
Well, that's
I'm not
good.
somebody that worries too much. I always think that the best outcome is always going to happen.
So
but
you're an optimist.
I'm an optimist for
Okay.
sure.
Can you take us back to 2003 when you're a young journalist and you're in the heat of battle as a journalist, and take us back into that moment and describe what's happening to you?
Absolutely. I was just recently graduated from Columbia University's journalism school, and I realized I wanted to do sort of investigative documentaries. And I'd been in New York during 9/11, and it was an incredibly traumatic experience for me. And I ended up being the only Portuguese journalist in Manhattan at the time. So I did all the reporting from ground zero for several days or weeks back to Portugal. And I was 24 years old. But I realized then that I was sort of on a mission to do investigative journalism, and 9/11 really marked me. And so when the United States invaded Iraq, and then President Bush came out and said that it had been a big success and that Saddam Hussein had been toppled and that there was going to finally be peace in Iraq, I decided right there and then that I wanted to move to the Middle East and sort of be close to a region that I knew was going to be incredibly important in terms of news events in the future. And I wanted to learn Arabic, and I wanted to sort of be close to that story. So I moved to Syria, which is a neighboring country to Iraq. Iraq was too dangerous. Again, I was a 25-year-old freelance journalist, and I enrolled in the University of Damascus. And there's it's a police state, so the secret police are everywhere. And you're not allowed to be a journalist in Syria unless the government knows, and they have to give you sort of a license to be a journalist, and you usually have a government minder with you at all times, so you can't work freely as a journalist. So I didn't tell anyone that I was there, that I was a journalist. I just told everyone I was there to learn Arabic. And I started making friends, and even to my friends I wouldn't tell them, because I wanted to be able to look for ideas and sort of find things that I wanted to report on. And eventually became very good friends with a Syrian man who was from this small border town that borders between Syria and Iraq, that is now the last stronghold of ISIS. And he told me that he was from this little town, and all his friends were crossing from Syria, his Syrian friends, into Iraq to fight against the Americans. So they would disguise themselves as civilians, they would cross the border in the cover of darkness, and they would basically, try to kill American soldiers. And this was something that was not in the news at the time. The US government and President Bush were touting this as a huge success. And no one was talking about an insurgency. And this sort of raised a lot of alarm bells. Wait a second, I've been reading all about this conflict, and nothing says, there's no talk of these foreign insurgents coming in to fight against the American invasion. And so I asked him if he could take me to his town so I could meet some of his friends and talk to some people. And that's when the adventure began. My boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, Darren, who had been to Columbia University Journalism
His last
School.
name is?
Darren Foster.
Yep.
And he'd gone to Columbia University Journalism School with me. We fell in love at Columbia University. And he was a print reporter, and I wanted to be a television journalist. And he came to visit me in Syria, and I told him about this story. And we both decided it was an important story. We needed to go up to this town with our friend Tarek and see what was happening there. Nothing would have prepared us for what happened when we got there. We thought that people wouldn't be willing to talk on camera to us about what they were doing, because on the one hand, it could get them in trouble with the law, obviously, because the Syrian regime didn't want this at the time to be open, and they didn't want people to know that they were allowing, essentially. They said that they were allowing Syrians to go into Iraq to fight against the Americans, and this would bode really badly for the Syrian regime. And on the other hand, there's a lot of different factions in this area, so they could get in trouble with all these other factions, including Al-Qaeda. There was a strong Al-Qaeda presence in this area at the time. So we never thought we were going to get people on camera, but we wanted to see for ourselves and sort of get a sense of what was happening there. So we took a little camcorder, and Tarek introduced us to all of his friends.
And were you covered up and,
Yes.
easily recognizable as a tourist, or?
It's a good question, because we were there for a whole week and we barely saw any women on the streets. This is an incredibly conservative area, and women are mostly stay at home. And the women that we did see were completely covered. So the whole time I had a hijab on, the whole time I was there. And this was, to respect the local culture, but also to sort of keep a low profile.
Mm-hmm.
I'm blonde, and I also dyed my hair brown at the time, just because I didn't want to be, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't the focus of everyone's attention once I got there. But as soon as we got to the market, we thought, I'll be fine. I have my hijab on, my head cover. We have this little camcorder. We'll go to the market. We'll start filming. People would tell people we're tourists. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as soon as we took out the camera and started filming, there was a guy on a loudspeaker that started shouting, "Americans, Americans," or basically Westerners is what they mean, but they were saying Americans, Americans, shouting, and suddenly we were surrounded by people, threateningly, in a very threatening way. And we had an 8-year-old kid that came towards us with a knife, and jokingly, but nonetheless, like a knife that he was coming towards us with. And we literally ran out of the market. It was really scary, and we're not, easily scared, but it was a very sort of uneasy situation.
You've been, as we talked about before, you've been in so many challenging situations. You've said that you'd rather be out there risking it all to tell a story than even being in LA traffic. And I'm just interested, what is it about that? Is it a passion to get the truth out? What is it that drives you to want to tell these stories?
I do it ultimately because I do believe that what drives me is I think that there are very important stories out there, and I believe that somebody needs to tell them. And I have the incredible honor of being able to be one of those vehicles, to be able to tell these stories about these really important issues and how they're affecting people all around the world. And I think the challenge most of the times is not so much, yes, it's risky and it's difficult, and a lot of times we find ourselves in very sort of difficult situations, but I think the biggest challenge for us is making sure that even though we're telling stories about people very far away that at the surface have nothing that connects us to them, is making those stories connect to us in a way that we can look at that and it's like, that could be me.
How challenging is it for journalists right now, where we live in a world where there's so many doubters about the picture that journalists are painting of what's happening in the world? There are a lot of doubters. Oh, that's their skew on the story. And there's this constant discussion about where the truth really lies. How hard is it now in 2018 where we're talking about, fake news?
Right. It's awful. It's more than just trying to figure out where the truth lies. Is like actually there's now people debating what the truth actually means. If the truth is really the truth, it's gotten to ridiculous proportions. And I do think that it hurts me deep inside every time I hear that term, the fake news. It just does, because I know so many of my colleagues out there, that are doing incredibly important work, that aren't being paid the salaries of, CEOs, and they're not doing it for the money, essentially. They're doing it because it's important.
Yeah.
And because we need journalism, we need the media. And
the media the news is not the enemy. We need to be enlightened, right?
Absolutely. We need the media. This democracy would not work if the media didn't exist, if the press didn't exist.
And it can't be controlled in the way that so many people want to control.
Keeping checks and balances, right? That's what we're all about. So this, just calling it fake news is giving a bad name to everyone out there who is doing a very big part in keeping our democracy healthy and alive. It's very important to remain neutral, but it's also, I think, important to have an opinion when that opinion is necessary, and to show that you're a human being. Some of the stories that I've done, for example, there have been moments where you're supposed to stay and keep yourself composed,
right?
And that's not always the case. And
right.
I do think that actually it's important to show that we're also human beings.
Right.
And through us being human beings, we can help our viewers also understand what it's like to be there and to feel that and to live through that situation.
Yeah.
So I think that's the difficult balance.
That's the balance. And go back to your point before, where you want to bring that emotion and how you react as a mother when you see another mother struggling with their child.
Absolutely.
I guess where it becomes challenging is if it's politicized, if it's a particular point of view, political point of view that you have, and where you don't let that get in the way of telling the story.
Yeah. And right? I try very hard not to, and I don't think I do. I'm also a very important aspect of journalism for me of the journalism that I do is empathy. I'd say that's sort of the key word that I hold with me and travels with me everywhere. It's empathy. It's whether, even when you're talking to people that are considered to be the enemy for many people, or you approach that subject always with a little bit with empathy, because it is important to try to understand why they did what they did and how, sort of walk in their shoes for a little bit, whoever it is that you're talking with. And I always try to do that. And I'll tell you the story of the Nigerian militants. That was very interesting. So we were in the Niger Delta in Nigeria doing a story about the oil conflict there. And there's this group of militants called MEND, it's their group, and they were at the time, protesting the exploitation of oil in their region, and how all the money from the oil industry was leaving the country, not staying. And in order sort of to call attention for their fight, and their struggle, they started kidnapping oil workers, so foreign oil workers that were living in Nigeria. And they were stealing oil from the pipes and doing all sorts of operations in the Niger Delta. So we spent, my husband and I spent about 2 weeks there. And the goal was always to actually go and meet the militants. We wanted to see what they had to say, why they were doing this, and hear their side. It always happens with journalists, and that's why it's important to stay optimistic, is that the access usually happens within the last sort of day or hour that you're there, and it's when you've almost given up and you're like, okay, this is never going to happen, I'm tired, I just want to go home. But if you persist just a little bit longer, persistence is another of my keywords, it is guaranteed, it's almost always guaranteed to happen. And this was one of those cases where all these doors that we were promised had been closed. Everybody had told us that there's no way they're doing their operations right now, they're too busy, or they're too scared to meet with the media right now, or it's not in their interest, it's never going to happen. And then I think it was like the last day that we were there, we heard that somebody was able to contact some of them and they agreed to meet us. But the thing was that we would have to get in this car, and because we weren't supposed to know where the location was. So we'd get into this car, and this driver that I guess worked with them would take us to this place. And it was maybe an hour, maybe a 2-hour drive, we weren't sure, but it was going to take us to this place, and then there we would meet the militants. But nothing else was told. And then that this driver would bring us back home, which is the only thing. Or is he going to bring us back to our hotel? And they said yes.
It's such a huge risk, though.
It is a huge risk. It is a huge risk. But we had gotten in touch with this through a Nigerian journalist that had been in touch with MEND, with this group for many years. And we trusted, in this case, with our lives, trusted this person with our lives. And she was an amazing, very critically acclaimed Nigerian journalist. And she told us, it's okay. If they said it's okay, it's okay. If they said they want to meet you, it's not in their interest to kidnap you or or harm you in any way. They want to tell and share their stories. So Darren and I got in the car with our little camera, and it was just the two of us. For years we worked, it was just the two of us. He'd be the producer and camera person.
Is this a great way to fall in love, by the way?
It was amazing. You have no idea the adventures we had.
Yeah.
I mean, the diseases, I flesh-eating parasite in the Amazon. I got a weird bug in this trip in Nigeria that my whole body was covered in hives, and he had to take me to a local hospital, and all sorts of adventures.
He's seen you at your best and your worst.
He's seen me at my best and worst, and he still loves me.
That's real love.
So I always said that I travel not only with the person, the camera guy, the director, producer, but also my personal bodyguard. I mean, a guy who I know would do anything for me.
Take a bullet for you if he had to.
Exactly.
He's going to be there for you.
So I'm incredibly lucky.
Yeah.
So we get into this car, we travel for like an hour or so, and then we get to this, and we're in the middle of nowhere, and we're traveling into this sort of green area with no houses or nothing around it. And we go into this, basically we stop the car in this little port area. So there's all these sort of canals and swamps, the Nigerian swamps. And there was this little tiny port, and we get there, and we're still in the car, Darren's getting his gear together, I'm getting my stuff together, and suddenly we hear a little knock on the window, and it's this like 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid. And we roll down the window, and he says, I think it was Oyibo, how they say white person. I think that was the word in a Nigerian. Hey, white person, the people you're looking for are over there, so just go over there. So we get out of the car, and we sort of follow this kid. And still, Darren is sort of fixing his gear and looking down. I'm doing something and also looking down, and suddenly I look up, and there it is, the little port area, which is basically just a couple of wood planks out into the swamps. And I look up, and I see 9 or 10 guys, most of them like in their early 20s, 19, 20-year-olds, holding AK-47s and waiting for us. And with these like masks and their heads covered and just waiting for us. And I look up, and it's Darren, holy shit. Look, he looks.
Look what's ahead of us here. Keep walking ahead.
And he does, and he was like, holy shit, let's keep it cool. So we walk up there, and we introduce ourselves very politely. It's always important to keep very calm. We can start getting nervous there. It's not going to solve anything. So very calmly, and we explained we're journalists. We're here to talk to you guys. We want to figure out why you tell your story, all that stuff. And they said, okay, we're going to take you to our base. So they get us in a boat, and immediately they have whiskey in the boat, and they start drinking whiskey and asking us if we want to drink some of their whiskey. I think we actually took a couple of sips as well.
Just to assimilate.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
it's very important
gesture.
to show that we're not
Hey,
above
we're
anyone
good.
here. So yeah, it's important to eat and do as they do and
Yes.
do as they tell you, and as they ask you, and be polite. And yeah, and we get into the boat, and then he drives us up to the camp. And at this point, adrenaline, I'm very excited because I'm not only because this is a crazy situation, but also
This is what you
an
thrive for,
experience.
right?
Yes.
I mean, this is what you
it's
want.
It's an amazing
You're heading to the
experience.
meat of the story.
Yes, and because I know that I'm finally going to be able to tell the story that I wanted to tell.
Yeah.
And so we get to the base, and there's General Shoot at Sight, that's his nom de guerre, is waiting for us at the camp base. And he's got his white wife beater on, and something around his head as well. And he's holding his own AK-47.
And how old is he?
He's in his 40s.
Okay.
And we get there, and he says, takes one look at me, and I'm so sorry. We allow the man to go into the camp, but there's no way you can come into the camp because that's bad juju. That's like bad luck. And a woman, if you step on this camp, then that's the end of our activities here because we'll be blessed, or there'll be bad luck for the rest of our lives. Which was awful.
Yeah.
Here I am, traveled all this way, and now Darren's going to be able to see it, and I'm not. It's going to break me. But
you said, I used to be a man, and I really still am a man. I'm disguised as a
I
woman.
said, guess who wears the pants in the house? It's not him.
Yeah, right. It's me. Okay.
No, so they allowed Darren to go into the camp, but then we were able to convince them to go out on the boats they had. And they also wanted to show their arsenal. So they came out with all their weapons and their several speedboats. And we did the interview with General Shoot at Sight with all his speedboats going around us in circles just to sort of show their...
He wanted to show his might.
Power, exactly.
Yeah.
Boots on the ground journalism is something that has been a little bit lost in the past few years.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's cheaper to make studio television,
right,
essentially. And because, when you just have to get two people to disagree on something, and that makes
great TV.
Ratings. Great TV, people like that,
Yeah.
But I truly believe that real journalism is, not only the people that make phone calls and have a long list of people that they're calling and investigating, but also boots on the ground, actually going there and hitting the field and spending time there.
Which is kind of nice that now you're working on Explorer.
Oh, it's fantastic.
You
again.
literally explore the world.
Oh,
and you've done some really fantastic stories. So you mentioned that you have an 8-year-old child, and I'm just interested, since you've had your child together, whether that has influenced your choices and stories and where you go, and whether it has affected your choices in terms of what happens in a story, like how far you'll push following a story when you're in it.
I think yes, a little bit, but I also think experience. Just the more stories you do and the more sort of iffy situations you've been in, the more you realize that maybe you should be a little bit more careful.
Yeah.
I see a lot of the stories and
so
things.
It's maturity,
yeah,
as well as just the fact that you've got a kid.
Yes, absolutely. I do think that in a way also, on the flip side of that, I think it's pushed me more into, yes, maturity has held me from maybe putting myself in some of the situations that I did when I was 24 years old going to Syria. But at the same time, I do think on the flip side is that every single story I do out there is not so much about me being a star at 20 years old. It's more because I'm trying to make my family proud, and I want to make my son proud. And I want to be sure that, when I'm out there, since I'm away from him, that I'm doing, and that I'm working as hard as I can and as much as I can to tell this story, that there's a reason I'm out there, that I'm not just making...
You have a real purpose in life, and,
Yes.
and as he gets older, he's going to understand just how important it is.
Just talking about him makes me emotional sometimes, so I got
That's
caught
great.
up there.
Isn't it wonderful, right?
It's incredible.
It's a life-changing thing.
Oh, it's completely life-changing. It is.
Yeah.
It's the word that I mentioned before, empathy too. It's something that I carry even more with me now in stories, because when you become, responsible for another human being's life, you realize just how challenging it is to raise up good people.
You seem to have a propensity for stories about underdogs, people who are struggling against the odds. Where do you think that comes from?
It's more of the people that I think need to have a light on them, and that they don't currently do. It's the stories I think that are underreported, that are the ones that really attract me the most. The stories that, for whatever reason, really haven't been reported much on, but that I do think are important to be reported on.
You've gone on to do such an elaborate collection of stories. This OxyContin Express story, powerful. How did you decide to follow that? Why did you decide to follow that story?
So I was working at Current TV at the time, and we'd read a small little clip on the Miami Herald at the time it was a small little story about how all these pain clinics were opening up all around South Florida, and how at some point there were more pain clinics in South Florida than there were McDonald's.
What is a pain clinic?
A pain clinic is a place where supposedly you go if you don't want to go to an office doctor. You go to a pain clinic if you're in some sort of pain, and they can do a X-ray. They have X-ray machines, and they have a doctor on staff, and he can talk to you and give you some pills for you to basically start feeling better. The problem with these pain clinics is that they were giving out pain pills like they were Tic Tacs. There were people from all across the eastern seaboard and all across America that were coming down because it was really easy to get these drugs, to get OxyContin. At the time, nobody was talking about OxyContin. We did not have the opiate crisis as we see it nowadays in our hands. So I remember hearing OxyContin and pain pills, what is this? And like going online and looking into this and then finding out, oh wait, this might be a story. I mean, there's actually people coming from all over America to go to South Florida to get these pain pills. Are they in that much pain that they can't get their pain pills back in their states? What is happening here? And there was all this talk about this addiction to these new pharmaceutical drugs. And so we spent, I think it was like almost a whole year reporting on this story, going back and forth, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, all over South Florida, and then Kentucky and West Virginia and Ohio, and all the areas that were really being really hard hit by all these spills. So basically all these people were coming down, paying the doctors, saying, I actually filmed this undercover. I put an undercover camera on myself. I went to one of these pain clinics and I said, oh, I have back pain. Sometimes I can't walk very well. I have a little bit of a back pain. And they said, so what do you need? Would you like Percocets? Would you like OxyContin? It's as easy as
Just
that.
off what you said.
Just as off what we said.
No proper diagnoses.
No, they said, oh, you'll have to, this was at the reception, you'll have to meet the doctor
in the back,
and then you pay for the doctor.
And then they probably
it's
want
all
to do
all cash, no insurance accepted. The X-ray machine was right there, so you'd pay for the X-ray machine. And in a lot of these pain clinics, they were also dispensing the drugs themselves. So they were making money out of which is an incredible conflict of interest, because you're making money out of how many prescription pills I prescribe to you, right? So it's
and then once you
crazy
get people
situation.
on it, then they want to
then
stay
you're
on
hooked.
it.
So the thing that we found out about these pills is that they're incredibly addictive. It's basically heroin in a pill, right? They are incredibly helpful for people suffering from real pain, and they were initially prescribed for people with cancer, terminally ill cancer patients. But then they started being prescribed to everyone. I have a headache, here's an OxyContin, or a bottle full of OxyContins. I have a hip pain, here's a bottle of OxyContins. And what was really tragic is that a lot of people so these were sort of the crooked doctors that were doing it, and they wouldn't even look at the patients. They would just sign these prescription papers, and you give me $500 and here's 180 oxys and come back next week. And they would take them back up to West Virginia and Kentucky and sell them for 3, 4, 10 times as much. And then they would use that money to fund their trip to come back down and to sustain their own addiction. So it all led to what we see nowadays. But what was really tragic about it is that you had these crooked doctors, but you also had good doctors who, because they were persuaded by the pharmaceutical company making these pills, in this case it was Purdue Pharma that was making OxyContin, and they started a campaign in the 90s where they persuaded the medical community to give out more of these pills because they weren't addictive. Everybody knew they were addictive, that they really persuaded medical community. So you had these good doctors who would see, a 17-year-old kid who was injured playing football in school, and he comes in and what kind of pain? I'm in really bad pain. Here's a bottle of OxyContin, you'll feel much better. And they didn't mean badly, but one of the stories that we followed was this kid who was 17 years old when he got his first bottle of OxyContin. And 5 years later, he was doing heroin. And, as someone who with no addiction in his past whatsoever. And we keep hearing these stories. So we've been following. So we did the OxyContin Express. It raised all sort of alarms about what was happening in Florida. They used that film in Congress in Florida to sort of change the law
policy
there, which was incredible. It won a Peabody Award.
Yeah.
And it's one of the ones that I'm certainly most proud of. And we kept following that. We did 2 other films after that. One to look at heroin and how people were moving from OxyContin to heroin, and then the third installment of that was fentanyl, which we did just 2 years ago, which won a DuPont Award.
I love that in 2011 you received the prestigious Livingston Award.
Yeah.
And that was for a report that you did, Rape on the Reservation.
Mm-hmm.
The topics that you cover, wide, varied. Do they where are they coming from? I mean, you mentioned before with the OxyContin thing was an article that you read, and then you started digging. I mean, where are you going to for your ideas?
Right. That was also, it was brought to me actually by a producer who was working on that story. But it all started from a statistic, and it was a heart-wrenching statistic, which is that 1 out of every 3 women in indigenous reservations in this country are raped in their lifetimes.
God.
It is a crazy, crazy number. And when we saw that and when we heard that, we decided this is a story that we have to do. Why is it? Who's doing this and why is it happening? And I think so we spent time on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, spending a lot of time with a mother whose, I believe, 16-year-old daughter had been brutally raped and killed. And again, this mother had lost her daughter, but she could name, dozens of other women that she knew had been raped as well. Hadn't been killed, but had been raped as well. It was just something that was part of that community. And so we spent time there investigating and looking and searching for answers. And we spent a lot of time, actually, in that story there was a very powerful moment where we spent time in a high school talking to kids, because we wanted to see how far back this would go. Why is it okay to rape women? Because it seemed like for a lot of people there,
it was an accepted thing.
It was an accepted thing.
Yeah.
So we got a room with, I think, 3 or 4 high school kids, and it was incredibly eye-opening. I was not expecting it at all. But they started saying, yeah, my dad beat my mom. He'd get really drunk. Alcoholism is a big problem in this reservation. And I grew up watching my dad beat my mom, and women should be subservient to men. And I saw him come home, and if he wanted to, he could do whatever he wanted to. And so I think I want to be a man like him. And so he essentially said that he'd been all these parties that they'd go to, there's nothing to do in this community, they'd say, so they'd all get really, really drunk, and then they'd rape girls that were passed out drunk.
Why is it that they think that this is acceptable?
Right. It's much easier to just say, okay, point the finger and say you're guilty. I think it's much
and that's
harder.
wrong.
Yes.
But
and
why?
I think it's much harder to try and understand why.
Wow. You also have a quote which I really like. You say, when it comes to really tough stuff in life, mums are the last ones to give up the fight.
Oh, it's true.
Whether it's an amputee in Sierra Leone who agreed to have her arms chopped off by rebels in order to save her son, or the mother of a young man struggling with prescription drugs. As a female journalist, you're giving a voice to these women, and you talk a lot about connecting with women in your stories.
I do. I think that you see a lot of news stories. Even I'm guilty of that. It's a lot of times men are more willing to talk, and we do a lot of, sort of these dark underground stories, and a lot of times it's the men that are pulling the levers and really controlling these situations. And I think what I've been wanting to do and what I can bring in as a woman is to always try to show the female side of this and the power that a mother has. They do not give up, and even if their child dies or is killed, they keep at it. And they, so many women in the drug story, for example, stories that I've done, for example, where, women who've lost their kids, and it would be so much easier and probably more comforting to them perhaps to just give up or, just not want to think about it yet anymore. But so many of them have made it then their life's mission to not allow this to happen to anyone else, because they don't want to see any other mothers suffering like they're suffering.
I'm just wondering, is there a story that's out there you don't have to be specific because maybe you don't want anybody to get the scoop, but is there sort of a holy grail story that's out there waiting for you, even if you don't want to disclose it, like something you're eyeing up that you really have a passion for telling right now? Or are you just following what's going on in the news and looking for ideas?
I think that the opiate crisis, the biggest drug epidemic that America has ever seen, is all around us. We hear about it constantly, but I think that sometimes people get saturated and just decide, I don't want to hear about it. We already know there's an opiate crisis.
Tell me something new.
I think keeping at it is incredibly important. Well, fentanyl was a good one because it was an important one. I started hearing, because of all the contacts that we have in that world, about this drug called fentanyl. Nobody knew. I didn't know what it was. I'd been reporting about prescription drugs and opiates.
So tell us so we understand.
And suddenly somebody tells me, fentanyl, there are people dying of fentanyl. And I was like, what is fentanyl? And I did a search, and so it's a pharmaceutical drug. It's 50 times stronger than heroin, and it's essentially a painkiller as well. It's used, and it was approved by the FDA for terminally ill cancer patients, for people who are really in the last dying. Why? Because it is incredibly addictive. And yet, just like they did with OxyContin, there were pharmaceutical companies out there that started essentially marketing these drugs as not addictive and paying doctors speakers fees to prescribe more and more of these drugs to people that really didn't need them and shouldn't be using these drugs. And as I started reporting on this and finding out more about fentanyl and telling my boss, we have to do this story. It's a new drug. It's 50 times more powerful than heroin, and people are starting to die from it all over the country. We need to do this story. And so he said, after I insisted on this story for several months, he finally said yes, and we started doing the story, and it was even worse than we thought. New Hampshire, for example, there had been, I think, 5 times more people dying from overdoses of fentanyl than heroin. And now there was a huge spike in deaths last year from opiates. More people die from drug overdoses in this country, mainly opiates, than they do from car crashes, for example. It's the number 1 cause of accidental deaths in this country, or from gun injuries.
More than cars?
More than cars and more than guns. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Because guns is something like 35,000 people, I think, in the United States?
I believe last year it was something like 117 people a day are dying every day from an opiate overdose. Wow. And so then when we put out our story, and then Prince actually died of an overdose, and it was fentanyl as well. And suddenly everybody was talking about fentanyl. And that was, it's important to know that it's out there, because it's an incredibly dangerous drug, and it's out there, and again, it's still killing more and more people. So the opiate crisis, trying to figure out where it's coming from, but also how it started. And in many ways, it started because of American pharmaceutical companies trying to push their drugs. And so we can blame Mexico, we can blame China, where these drugs are made in labs. We can blame all these other countries, but ultimately the only way we're actually going to solve this problem is if we actually look at ourselves and realize this is an American-made problem. These drugs, this epidemic was created in America, and how can we change this so this doesn't happen again? And journalism is important for that. So because we are the ones that are, tasked and with showing that.
All right. Well, I have a feeling you'll be following that one.
I will.
Mariana, thanks for all your stories.
Thank you, Phil.
Where do people go if they want to learn more about you?
Well, Explorer.
Yes.
I have a couple of documentaries that I've worked on for Fusion as well.
Yes.
And hopefully more places, but hopefully more Explorer too. That's what we're hoping. We're at a hiatus now, but we're hoping that will come back. So more people watch Explorer, the more we'll be out there traveling, doing what we love.
What we love, telling stories of the world.
Yeah, and show how wonderful our world is. You know,
Yes.
get people to get out of their couches and go out and explore.
Yeah, get the passport.
How amazing is that?
And get out
do
and
it.
explore.
Yeah.
And don't go sit in a resort. Go immerse yourself with people.
Absolutely, that's what I say all the time. Yeah.
Drink the coffee they drink and try
Exactly.
things, and just be part of where you are. That's the best advice I can give people.
I agree, 1,000,000%.
Otherwise, you just are sort of transporting yourself into
Right.
a place that's just like home.
Exactly.
So we normally end with a few questions. So Mariana, if you were going to do a road trip across America, or maybe let's say you were going to take a long drive and you could have anybody from any time in history in the car with you, who would you take?
Holy moly. I would probably take Vasco da Gama. So he was a Portuguese explorer, one of the most famous explorers of all time.
Well, the Portuguese,
Portuguese
unbelievable mariners, explorers.
ruled the world once,
Yes.
many centuries ago. But here was a man, who was not afraid, and who took that getting out of the couch really to the next level.
Yes.
He got on these ships and traveled all around the
To
world.
the edge of the ocean.
and risked
falling off the other side.
If you think what I do is dangerous, this guy was crazy. And I really, my son is called Vasco,
Yep.
partly because of Vasco da Gama. And I would love to be able to sit down with him and find out what it was like to explore this unseen and unknown world so many centuries ago.
I'm sure you'd have a few stories to share with him. Who else would you take in the car? Because you got a couple other people.
Oh, I can take more people.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan. A person that has had an impact on my life has been Christiana Mampour. She's a journalist. I grew up also watching her reports from the Gulf War back in the day and thinking, wow, she's amazing. She's incredible. Here's a woman. You see so many men on television, and here's a woman who has a lot of knowledge and who is not afraid and who's out there telling the truth.
A strong voice.
A strong female voice. So she's always been a very important presence, and I've had the opportunity to meet her, and she's incredible. And I would definitely take her because there's so much that I want to learn more from her and from other female journalists around me. And then I would take my son because I do want him to
Because he could learn.
Yes, he already travels with me as much as possible. But how amazing would it be to have a kick-ass female journalist, Christiana Mampour, Vasco da Gama, his namesake, with all this history. He loves history, by the way. So with all this history behind him, telling him what it was like to conquer the world. I mean, that would be pretty spectacular.
Be awesome.
Can you make that happen?
Well, I'm just thinking about that. You know what? One day in the future, it may happen. You never know.
You never
They take
know.
his DNA and
It's
bring
true.
him back.
It's true.
And your last day on Earth, Mariana, if you knew that you were going to be having your last day on Earth, what would be that day? How would you set up your last day on Earth?
Surrounded my family and friends and a big party. I'm a sucker for parties. I love parties. I love hosting parties. I love having people around me. I'm a very sociable person. I love to drink.
Yeah. What's your drink of preference?
I love the Portuguese vinho verde,
Yeah.
which is sort of a half sparkling whitish wine, although it's called vinho verde, green wine. It's
Okay.
a very Portuguese
Is it a
thing, very
strong
refreshing.
alcoholic drink, or
No,
is it-
it's a wine.
It's
It's a wine. I like my wines. I
Okay.
like all colors of wines, all
Portugal.
sorts, all
Yeah.
brands.
Yeah.
As long as it's wine.
But sparkling.
Sparkling, even
Yeah.
better. I mean, if
Okay.
it's a really expensive bottle of champagne, if I can choose anything, really expensive bottles of champagne.
Verve. Are you a Verve, a Moet?
Give me everything that's
Yeah.
expensive. And then surrounded by family and friends, and at my house where I can host, and where I can just be surrounded by the people I love, but in a party setting.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Great.
so much,
Yeah,
Paul.
thanks
It
for
was
talking to me.
wonderful. Thank you.
You can watch this podcast online at philkeoghan.com. And let me know what's on your bucket list. You never know. You might be my next guest. Don't forget, ticket before you kick it.